Well, first of all, let me thank you all for inviting me to this conference in New Zealand, one of my favorite places to be. Of course, I am not in New Zealand. I am here in the University of Maryland. I wish I could be with you all, but it's just impossible to travel that distance and meet all my other commitments. But hopefully I will get back there again. It's one of my favorite places in the whole world. So you can see the topic here is meant to fit with the theme of the conference, which is having to do with strategies and strategic learning, strategic teaching. I'm going to talk about learning to learn effectively in today's hyper-connected world. I think we have to rethink the way we have taught, rethink the way we've learned in the past. And I want to talk specifically about strategies for students, but also for teachers as well. And I've got 4 main goals. It took me a while to get all these, but I got them. To describe, to detail, to discuss, and discover. What I want to describe are what I consider to be advantages and disadvantages of what it's like to learn in today's 24/7 world. No, there's no pauses, there's no breaks. Learning and information is continuous. Then I want to detail what I think is pluses and minuses for those who are trying to teach the I generation. And the I generation is the term that I use to describe students now who are populating schools up to about K-20. The students who have lived and are surrounded by technology. And then I want to discuss learning environments that fit students who have grown up in the technology world we live in now. What is that world, a classroom environment like that would be helpful to them? And finally, because I don't want to set teachers to the side, I want to talk about what is needed to support teachers today. That as we talk about the challenges that are going to unfold here for a moment, we have to think about how to support them, not just professionally, but also personally, in all the challenges that they're facing. All right, so first, let's describe advantages and disadvantages of being a student in this 24/7 hyper-connected world. There's a number of them. First of all, what used to be computers are now handheld in the form of telephones. Your telephones are far more sophisticated than the first computer I owned, by all stretches and imaginations. My first cell phone, which I thought was very, very progressive, was the size of a small purse and weighed about a ton. So you were walking around with this implement attached to your head. But so now literally we don't need big computers. Even my family members all have these computer watches that are probably smarter and faster, far more intelligent than some of the computers that we lived with for many years. The great side of social media, as exemplified by all my graduate students, is that you're connected not only to the people next door, but the people across the globe. I have colleagues now that I write with and research with all the time, but you can access them through social media or at least through technology. I must admit before we go any farther that I don't do social media. Anyway, information on almost any topic can be found in a matter of seconds. Google something and it'll pop up. I don't care how obscure the topic is. It's all around you. It's accessible in a matter of seconds. The other good thing about it, for those of us who grew up in the age of paper only, whatever people write, that's relevant to classroom instructions that you're teaching, it's constantly updated. It's not like you have to wait for the next edition of a textbook to come out. And as soon as the textbook that I wrote was done, it was already dated in so many ways. So the information that may be necessary for instruction is constantly updated. Another advantage, it's possible to chronicle and post, as we know some people do, events that happen in the real time, in that moment. We've seen transformational events in the world as a result of somebody capturing something on social media, on the internet in some sort of way. A simple camera shot could reveal, as we know, abuse and maltreatment of individuals around the globe. And truthfully, things are done much faster than they were before. I don't know if they're done better. That's something we'll talk about. But certainly in the old days when we actually had to cut and paste, which is why the words exist on the internet, we literally had to cut and paste when we edited papers and articles in the dark ages. That's before they had electricity. But seriously, now you just can edit at the speed of light. As I'll say, I'm not sure it's always better as an end product. And then multimedia there's freedom in it. There's freedom to find different ways to locate information. I work with medical doctors and interns, and one of the things that they do is constantly use the internet as a way to instruct themselves on some new procedure, some new drug that just came out, and inform them about it. And then our everyday activities can be both, as it says, can be done virtually. As we know right now, we're struggling at the University of Maryland to bring faculty back to their offices. We're struggling in some ways to get students comfortable with coming back into a classroom. We have lived our lives in our sweatpants and our whatever else we wore in those days, where only your top half ever showed. Now we have to go back and be social in a way that we weren't required to do for some period of time. And there's not only just real reality, there's virtual reality. There's something called the metaverse. I haven't even got into the universe, but now there's a metaverse in all this thing. But the point being that there's so many levels and layers to what can be experienced. It's hard to tell which is better, the virtual or the real in some days for students. And finally, there's new devices. One of my students is busy right now working on one of these sorts of apps. And there's, as it says there's an app for that somewhere. Whatever you want to do, somebody's invented an app for it. So we have all these devices and apps that allow us to be more productive, not really, but or to have more fun and to enjoy the world around us. So those are all the advantages. But let's be honest. There are also disadvantages that have to be considered. For one, if you look around, you find that a lot of pre-adolescents to adolescents, and now I would say some adults, can't live without the device in their hands, in their possession, somewhere where they can reach it instantaneously. That has become a real problem in counseling, where some entire therapies are devoted to the addiction that comes with technology. And the other thing, of course, is they're everywhere. They're all around us all the time, which can be a difficulty because if you're trying to do something and somebody, you get that little ding, I guess it is, a ding or some noise, it tells you that somebody's trying to get you and suddenly your attention is gone. It's directed somewhere else. And it leads to multitasking. That's been demonstrated in the research. So the availability and the presence of them just in your area can lead to multitasking, which means detriment to learning. The other thing that I spend a lot of time with, even with undergraduates at the University of Maryland who are extremely bright students, is they don't really notice. They don't really attend to what's around them. So that you can have students who sit in the same seat. I have 100 students in a class. And the students choose to sit in the same seat. They're creatures of habit. And what's interesting about it is I'll ask them to describe who sits around them, without looking. Who's on the right or left of you? Who's behind you? Who's in front of you? They don't know. They don't notice. Their ability to perceive the real world is not very strong. And as a person who teaches about intelligence, who teaches about reasoning, about problem solving, one of the step ones is what do you notice? What are you seeing? And if you are not perceptive, you will not be an effective problem solver. You will lose many opportunities to have acquired information in your realm. So we have to teach them to be mindful. Now there's all these trainings to teach students and adults to attend to what's going on around them. And I remember the jokes about, I have 300 likes on my whatever it is at the time. Maybe it was Facebook. Was Facebook? Who knows? And the mother said, I have 5, but mine count, in some statement. And that statement says a lot, because you may have all these connections in social media, but for a lot of students, they're superficial. They're not really personal in the meaningful sense, which leaves them, surprisingly, feeling even more lonely than if they had just 1 or 2 people that they can truly interact with in a meaningful way. And Dorothy Espelage, who's one of the world's experts on bullying, also talks about this impersonalness of the internet can lead to the ability that you can bully someone. You can make comments and snide remarks to them and feel as if you're not responsible at all. They'll never know who you said it, they'll never know who you are. And that kind of situation can only add to the social emotional detriment of students. Another thing, privacy. I don't know what that is anymore. What students believe is private in their lives anymore. Because in truth, you're tracked all the time. Before I finish this presentation, this was an article that came into the Washington Post, and it shows that the 2/3 of the apps that children use actually spy on them, track them, track what they care about, what they look at, what they do. I worry about that. We all have a right to privacy. We all have a right to close our door, or to feel that we have times when what we do, what we say, how we act is nobody's business but our own. Okay? Anxiety, depression, look at the APA database. It's just surging. We thought it was bad during the pandemic, but we had no idea what the ramifications are. At universities in the US, 3 of them where I have family, all cases, there's the cases of attempted suicide have increased like 3-fold in the last year. Something is going wrong where this need to be connected in real ways to other people is suffering or suffered. All right, there's no regulation of who puts what on the internet, on the web. And that means you can look up information at the drop of a hat, as I said to you before, but how do you know if it's truthful? How do you know if it represents accurate, scientific, evidence-based comments, or just somebody's imaginations? I don't know. Of course, this ease of processing, the speed at which I get things, the ease at which I can locate, and the speed actually don't contribute to improved performance sometimes. It diminishes performance. We move so fast, quickly through the information that we're not judging it. We're not taking time to reflect on what it's telling us. And so we have to prepare our children for the fact that they don't necessarily know things as well as they think they do. That they have not necessarily gathered the important information that would lead to a sound judgment. And as all my students will tell you who are teaching right now, we find that the desire to read anything more than a paragraph, that the writing is all they're suffering, that it's declining. And whether or not it's only due to the technology, we cannot say. But the point being, we find that students prefer to cut and paste than to do their own thinking, as we were talking about just today. Right. So now let's detail. Let's detail some pluses and minuses for those of you who teach these students. What is good about an I-generation student from a pedagogical standpoint? The pluses. As we said, they have information they can get to. They don't need to be feeling as if they're divorced from the content. Now, it may not be personally meaningful to them, but at least they can find that information if need be. What we can do instructionally that's an advantage is that we can tie what's happening in something we read today to what's going on in the real world. We can pull that up. We can make those connections so that the real world can be connected in real time to what's going on in your classrooms. There's also a lot of different kinds of resources, even more than I'm aware of, that students can use to open their minds for creativity, for expression in ways that are not singular. We don't have to dictate one form of production. And one of the most important uses of the technologies that are advancing is it helps students who have specific needs. We call it adaptive technologies. And in places where they have special needs that can't be met in any other way, are unique ability levels or abilities that can't be addressed in a normal classroom under a normal circumstance, or certainly if they have any particular identified disability or cognitive ailment, that adaptive technology is a wonderment. We can keep data much more readily. For those of you who believe in evidence-based teaching practices, you have to know what your students know. You have to keep track of what they understand and all that. But now the technology makes it easier for us to do that. And again, as I said, the technology allows for creativity. If one chooses to use it, you can be far more creative and express yourself in many ways, by sound, by music, it doesn't matter. The options are there for you. And whether you find this positive or not, it's easier for you to communicate with students and parents now as a result of the website that exists for schools. As I said, I don't know if you feel that's advantage, because then they can get you anytime. But at least the possibility is there. And finally, if necessary, what we have developed now as technologies allow us to go back to having to offer instruction virtually, if that happens again. Let's hope it never does. Let's hope we don't have to lock down for another 2.5 years, as some of us have. All right. But then, of course, I have to give you the minuses, too. We've just gone through the pluses. One of the things is I want to make clear, and this is backed up by studies that we're doing ourselves in our lab and other people have done, students think they're far more savvy about technology than they really are. Yes, they can get on fast, they can download apps, they can do all those sorts of things, but the kind of use of the technology that's really important may not be well developed in them. And so we have to be careful not to assume that students are technologically savvy, that they are digital natives, which in many ways they are not. And again, the research that we and others have done, students seem to be comfortable in reading online. It's quick access, they can read on the screen, but in truth, their performance is far better in print. And this has been shown in a series of 6 studies now. And every time, that's what happens. Students' comprehension, their search strategies, all of that is stronger and better. Their comprehension scores are higher when they're reading in print. Same texts. And the other thing, I used to feel I was great as a teacher. I used to feel that way before I knew better. But I used to feel like I could walk in a classroom and within seconds I had the students. They were with me. They wanted to hear what I had to say. They wanted to learn from what I had to say. Now, yes, I can still do that, but it takes a long time for them to buy in to who I am, to buy into what I have to say. That I have to some ways fight through what I call an information barrier for them, because they are so surrounded by so much information. They have to feel that what I have to tell them is worth something. So I almost have to find a way to break into that bubble they put themselves in, where they say, make me pay attention. Prove to me that what you have to say matters. Whereas before, that was kind of a natural consequence of the process. I have a rule in my classes. Unless we need the computer, we have no computers up, we have no phones out. Now, if a teacher told you that, perhaps you would pay attention to it as well. It takes time, and we find them sneaking their phones somewhere, hiding it to the side, that sort of thing, because they don't want to be without that technology, even for a class period of some sort. And that's hard. It's hard when you have to constantly remind them to pay attention to what's going on here, that what I have to say to you has merit and value. It's difficult when you're fighting their need to, I think it's called FOMO. I don't know if it's still a term that's used anymore. The language changes a lot. But do they feel that they can even give up that period of 45 minutes to not look at their phone to see who's texted them, to not see what happened in the world in that short period of time? The one thing also we know is that having been somebody who wrote textbooks, that what you have is a situation where nobody wants to give up their content topic. Nobody wants to give up that piece of information. So what you find happening is that textbook authors, the books are getting fatter and fatter and fatter because nobody wants to give up the content in their subject area. But the treatment of that content is extremely shallow. It's superficial. It's what we call mentioning the content. You just throw the ideas in the book. And if you figure if you throw them in the book, the students will pay attention to them, the teacher will signal them, and the kids will get them. It doesn't happen. You can mention something 10 times, or you can choose to teach it once and teach it well. And the point being, when you have a curriculum that's a mile, I always get this backward, a mile wide and an inch deep, that all the students get is superficial understanding. Now that's okay if all you're doing is testing them for superficial knowledge. But if you're trying to build in them some degree of depth of understanding that will carry with them outside of your class and into their real lives, that kind of time spent in a classroom is a waste. You're just spinning wheels. You're just assuming that they'll pay attention to it because it is a class. And the other thing about teaching these students is, right now we know it's not just cognitive. It's not just me playing to their minds that matters. I have to play to their motivation. I have to think of their culture and their social background and weave that in. I have to be concerned about their well-being at the same time. All of those factors determine whether a student in my class is going to learn and learn effectively or not. And that's a lot. It's a lot to attend to. And we're not trained, many of us, as counselors. We're not trained necessarily as motivational speakers. We're trained to teach pedagogically, to have those strategies in hand, and hopefully to know our content well enough to play with it. But this is overwhelming to have to deal with that. The end result of it is what I have written about, which I call information management versus knowledge building. I'm going to introduce that concept to you here because it's something that we find that the students resonate with. When we first introduce it in a class, I watch the class, and you see that the students feel that. They feel indeed that this kind of description I'm going to give you kind of marks the way they now act as students. So what we have is information management on the one hand. Now I'll explain to you about this in a moment, and knowledge building on the other. But I want you to understand, it's not that it's a clear separation between the two. And in most cases, in order to function well in anything you're doing, whether you're a teacher, whether you're a graduate student, whether you're an undergraduate student, you must know how to play these off one another. They're always present in your life. But the difference is important. When you're an information manager, which I would say that most students have become in order to survive the world they're in, and the way schooling is structured, what they want to do is acquire information for a short period of time, and for some purpose or reason that is set by somebody other than them. They're not learning something for themselves, they're studying something in order to do well in a classroom, to get a good grade, to get a diploma, to get out of school. And the interesting phenomena about information management is that the old notion of that you learn and you keep information has fallen away. There's not something we now call long-term memory anymore that says as soon as something gets into your memory, it's there. Oh, and there's working memory, which is the stuff that's alive in your mind right now. I've added something we call fragile knowledge to that information processing model. Because what we know now is any student you have can learn content and hold on to it for some period of time. But as soon as that external need is gone, it just evaporates. It's gone. The tether that held it together in their mind is cut and severed, like an umbilical cord. And I know this is the case because I've seen it happen, but I also remember a student who came to me who now is a master's student in the college, who said, you know, Dr. A, you were the best teacher I ever had. I just loved your class. And I said, really? I said, what do you remember about the class? The only thing that student ever remembered was that I read and wrote backwards. That was it. Nothing about the content. And so I must not be the great teacher she claims to be, because there was nothing tethered in memory to what I had taught her. On the other hand, I would suspect that many of you listening to this now are knowledge builders. What distinguishes a knowledge builder is very important. Knowledge builders choose to pursue understanding for themselves because they want to understand something. They want to hold on to it. They want it to be part of them that they can draw on once a class is over. They can draw on once they walk out of that class or that university or that elementary school. They want it to be part of what they know and they can use in the real world. That's knowledge building. Now, why is that different, and what's the consequence of it? One of the big differences is when you are simply information managing, your key question that you ask yourself is this going to be on the test? Am I going to be held responsible for this? When you ask yourself, if you're a knowledge builder, that's not the question you ask. If you are a knowledge builder, you ask the question, is this important to me? Is this something I can judge as being truthful information, accurate information? You see, if you're an information manager, students, especially my advanced gifted students that I taught for years, would say, you know, I know the teacher told me something wrong. I know that content, but better than the teacher. But I'm going to put down on the test exactly what the teacher told me, even if it's wrong, because that's what gets me the points. Whereas if you're a knowledge builder, you're constantly juggling whether or not what you are hearing makes sense. Does it fit with the evidence? And you know you're a knowledge builder. You know it right now. If while I'm saying all this, you're talking to yourself in your head. Did that make sense? Have I seen that before? Or do I disagree with that? I think that's you're constantly battling the information that's coming at you against what you hold to be more accurate or truthful versions of your experiences and your knowledge. And it stays with you. The goal is that it travels with you wherever you go. Well, let's now turn to discussing learning environments that are adaptive to the needs of these I-generation students. And I'm going to break these down into different domains. So I'm going to talk about the cognitive side first. Cognitive side, what goes on in the head, the thinking, the reasoning. And I think to create an environment that works for these students, the first thing we need to do is convince them that learning is more important than achievement, that becoming effective learners is far preferable to being good students, meaning you obey the mandates of the classroom just to get grades. And instead of trying to teach everything in a classroom, to throw it all up on the wall and see what sticks, a good teacher in those kind of environments for an I generation needs to know what the priorities are. What are the key points and ideas that I want my students to remember 5 years from now when I run into my teacher again? What are those 5 principles? And as a teacher, those 5 principles should be core to everything you do. You weave them back and forth to those principles all the time so the students have a sense of what is the core to some domain of information and knowledge. Don't do it all, but do it well. The other thing is, if you really want to teach, students need to have time to think, to reflect, to play with ideas. And I watch what makes a good teacher, and they really allow whatever idea they're presenting to be to have time on the table, to have time in the minds of the students, to have a chance to treat them in different sorts of way. Time, instructional time, is a good indicator of what students may knowledge build about in the future. If you teach and assess in one way, students will come to internalize that one assessment method as the way to decide whether or not they know or understand something or not. And you know that we still take assessments, right? That if the assessment is superficial, if you can guess at it without really understanding, then it doesn't require you to deeply process. We want to use variety. We want to have some points where the students go deep. They have to learn to practice writing and thinking and justifying as we do it in our classrooms. That they have to tell you not just what they think, but why. What's the evidence that supports it? And with that, what you want students to feel comfortable with, however, is that the way you're assessing them has some sort of framework to it. It comes out of some way that you understand what's important. So they should know how you're going to judge them. What matters to you should be predictable in the way you give them feedback, for example, and tell them what you find in their responses that are solid, but what requires some concern. One of the things that we have found, probably the last 3 years more than we've seen it evident before, is that students in the US, I can't claim to know what's true about New Zealand, but the students in the US are very poorly calibrated, which means they really cannot tell you what they know well and what they don't. They cannot tell you whether they have performed well or they haven't. They have a very poor sense of their own abilities. That's why one of the great PISA studies where the US students in mathematics scored themselves at the top in terms of their efficacy beliefs. How well do they do math? How well do they understand math? They were really in the lower, I think, third of the distribution in terms of performance. We, as US students and individuals, feel good about not knowing very much. That's not a very nice thing to say. But calibration is something that you can be taught. It's nothing you're born with. And that means students have to learn how to judge their performance, how to explain why they believe they did well or not well on something. And that comes from experience. We have to help them be their own judge of their performance. Feedback. If John Hattie, my dear friend from New Zealand, were here, now that he's in Australia, I guess you still talk to him. But he would say feedback is extremely important, but only if that feedback tells you something. You know, there's that empty feedback that we all got on our test. Great job. Nice. Oh, look at that. But it doesn't tell you anything. You want details. You want to say what's strong about that response, what's not strong about that response, what you need to think of next time when you do this kind of question. That's the feedback that is informative. But always it's focused on the task and what was done, not the person. I mean, even as graduate students and as a professor who gets reviews periodically, we take feedback personally. Even if it's about what we did, we think it's a picture of us. That means I'm not worth something. That means I'm not good enough. The feedback must always be about the task and not the person, even if it's positive, by the way. Praise can be very detrimental to students if it's focused on praise of person, not of performance. The other thing is, I'm a great believer in the fact that content should not sit in isolation. Even when I was in school in those dark ages, as I talked about, you know, you studied Sister Colette in second grade history, and then you went to third grade math with Mrs. Flattery. And what we learned in one class was not to ever bleed over into the other. And I remember one nun saying to me something like, I don't care how Sister X did that. That's not how we do it now. So they actually wanted you to separate it, to break it off and put it aside. But the mind doesn't work that way. Effective learning doesn't work that way. We should find ways to always tie in, always connect. Look for ways that things thread through, or Even if they don't thread through, how do they conflict? What about them isn't going together? But that's why we have our students do a lot of mapping of concepts and ideas to look for transfer opportunities whenever they can. And we do believe it's important to teach students to reason relationally. Now that means how do things fit together in a meaningful sort of way, both in terms of fitting together nicely or creating conflict. Conflict is as important, when ideas conflict, it's as important as finding that they fit together nicely. The other thing that I am pushing for now as a critical strategy for today's students is this idea of epistemic competence. And what do I mean by that? Different questions, different content areas, problems of greater or less magnitude require different kinds of proof or evidence or support. Epistemic competence is knowing what kind of evidence fits the question at hand. Let me give you an example. Let's say you're a mother and you want to know whether or not to send your kid off to school with what we would call raincoat. I forget what you all call it in New Zealand. Anyway, but a raincoat. Now, are you going to do a study to find that out? No, you're either going to say, hey Siri, what's the weather going to be like today? Or you put your head out the door and you look, right? That's the level of evidence that's necessary. But what if you're a meteorologist, a weather person, and you have to predict whether or not a plane should take off from this airport on this day given the weather? If all you're going to do is stick your head out the window, you're in real trouble, right? The level of evidence is and the consequences of that evidence is much higher. Much higher. And you also look for some sort of confirmation or backup. Okay, let me do the social emotional. You're sticking with me, I appreciate it. We have just a few more slides to go. In terms of social emotional areas, the one thing that I believe in strongly, as do some of my doctoral students at the time, is that students come into your classroom with a history. They come into your classroom with experiences that relate to that personal history, cultural, ethnic, even parental, familial sorts of histories. If you want to teach a person, you must know a person. You must know enough to take what you're teaching and link it to those students in a way that's personally relevant to them. And you strive to make every student feel that they count. I don't know if any of you here have ever had the experience of being in a classroom where you felt that somehow you were on the fringe. You didn't necessarily feel you belonged. When that happens, you were more hesitant to speak out. You were more hesitant to devote time to what was going on in that classroom. Every student in your room has to feel they belong. And it's your job, our job as educators, and even as peers in a classroom, to make people feel they belong. The other thing is we cannot assume that students know how to collaborate. I hear that word all the time. Let's do cooperative learning. Let's do collaborative learning. Let's do group work. Let's have a discussion. I can tell you right now that if you don't train them how to do that, the outcome is not going to be as desirable as you want. We must teach students how to operate in social context, how to carry on a conversation and a discussion. When I came to this realization probably 5 years ago when I was teaching a large lecture class and we were having a discussion. And what I found was that each student would say something, and the next student would say something, and the next student would say something, no connection to what anybody had said. There was nothing we call uptake. In uptake, when I speak, I relate what I have to say to something that someone else has said so that I can see how ideas move and flow together. They need to be taught that. You're not born with it. And group work, just for group work's sake, would drive someone like me up a wall. I never was very good at group work, I have to tell you, okay? partly because I didn't learn how to do it very well, but also most of the time I ended up doing the work for the rest of the group. And that was not something I enjoyed. If you're going to ask me to work in some sort of collaborative, make sure it's a task that requires that, that needs that, and that I'm, in a sense, working with people whose input I trust and I can use and I can benefit from. The other thing is there's something I remember there was something called a broken window law in New York City. And I'll explain what that is and why it matters here. What it was about was the fact that there was a great deal of crime in the city, New York City. And the mayor at the time decided he would institute what he called the broken window law. The broken window law was if you take care of the small things when you see them, you attend to those right away, then there's not going to be a festering of bigger problems. And in the classroom, the same thing holds. It's not funny. It may seem funny when somebody calls somebody four eyes. I got that since I wore glasses since I was in second grade. Or, they make little funny names for the kids in the classroom. That sounds cute. It's not cute. It's a beginning of this idea that you can call someone something that's not friendly or kind, and it's just somebody looks at it like, ha ha ha, that's kids being kids. You must be attentive to that, and you must model the fact that no form of kind of insultive, demeaning sort of dialogue or discussion has any place in the classroom. None at all. Take attention, be a role model yourself to the fact that even small broken windows in terms of social mores must be dealt with. Also, I'm a Deweyan. John Dewey is my patron saint. And John Dewey made it clear that if you want somebody to learn, let them pursue something they love, they care about, they find interesting, because then it doesn't seem like work. And so, we can't do that all the time, I realize. Classrooms don't allow that. But you should set aside time when students have the freedom to make choices, when they can choose to pursue a topic or an activity that matters to them, because they care about it, and to bring it forward in terms of part of the curriculum. Second chances. We were talking about that just a few minutes ago with one of my doctoral students. There's nothing wrong with giving somebody a chance to redo an idea or to redo a project, to give them some guidance and let them try it again. If we only had one chances in most of our lives, I can't tell you how ugly our lives would probably be. We need multiple chances. We need multiple opportunities to show what we can do under better circumstances. Okay, technology. Again, do not assume that I-generation students are digital natives. The important technological skills need to be taught. Digital literacy is a real thing. And show students how to use the technology in ways that are facilitative, that will improve their ability to learn and to perform well. If you are a model, if you come in and show them memes every day, or you play games on the thing, but you don't use the technology in ways that are facilitative, you're sending them a message, and it's not a good one. Use it in the classroom, absolutely, but not just because it's there. You use the technology that exists in the instructional environment because you see a value and a use to it that will improve what you could do without it. Okay? And one of the things is we talk about is real-world problems. Technology is particularly useful, collaboration comes into play, when a problem is complex, when there's no easy right or wrong answer. If you can ask Siri or Alexa or whatever else those things are called by name, and get an answer that satisfies, that's not a real problem. It's not a complex problem. Ask Siri something like, should I go to grad school? Should I marry this guy or that guy? Or, who? If they answer that question, then maybe we're somewhere. But the truth is, they answer only simple questions, and that's a problem. One of the things is, how do you judge as a young child, young student, or somebody who's a novice in an area, how do you judge whether what you're reading online is right, accurate, truthful? How do you know? Part of it is, as teachers, we need to arm them with strategies for deciding whether something they're encountering is likely to be credible. And one of the activities we do this, I think an eye-opener, is we ask students to keep a record of how they spend their day, how much time they spend online. And when they're online, what do? Now I know now your apps, I said there's an app for that. Now there's apps that will track that for you on your smartphones. But how are you using your technology? How are they using their technology? That's a question that we need to find. And by having them look at their activities, that would be one way to do it. And when they're using multimedia, always emphasize the creativity. Emphasize the ability to transform what they would do otherwise. Not just slap it up on the page because it's a pretty picture. All right. Motivation. I know you're hanging in there. We're just about done, so stay with me. One of my students recently published a paper on relevance. And I think from that paper and the research that came up, I think we would agree that the most important form of relevance is what I call personal relevance. What do I mean by that? To be an effective teacher in this day and age, you really need to know your content well. Well enough that you can play with it. Well enough that you feel comfortable with it. But at the same time, as I said to you before, you must know your students. And personal relevance lies at the connection between the two. Knowing the content and knowing the student, how do you find a way to meaningfully bring them together? How do you show a student that mathematics isn't something just in a book that makes them anxious? It's something that has a value in their everyday, real lives that matter to them. Give them opportunities for choice. Small choices even are important. And we teach them how to make SMART goals. SMART goals means it's goals that they can track, that it specifies very clearly what they want to achieve, when they want to achieve it, and how they're going to go about achieving it. Teach them how to make their own SMART goals that they can then evaluate. And there's a whole movement now in psychology called positive psychology. And it's a phenomena that I don't know why it took so many generations to get to. It really says we spend so much time in school beating kids over the head with what they can do, that why should they ever feel good about schooling? We should strive to focus on strengths of students far more than we focus just on whatever they cannot do. And we need to convince students there's a thing called mindset. And in mindset, the idea is that a lot of individuals feel that who they are cognitively and ability-wise is set at birth. What you want to convince them is that they have power to change. They have power to grow their abilities in whatever area they want. It's all fluid. It's all flexible. Now you need smart guidance and you need help. But we can change who we are. We're not fixed in any sort of way. And the other thing is your classroom environment a place where risk is encouraged? Where they're free to offer up an idea, even if it sounds crazy, or they don't have to wait till they're sure they have the right answer before they speak. That's a kind of a classroom that you want. You want a classroom where students feel capable of offering a thoughtful opinion or to take a risk in offering an answer. I don't want to just hear from the kids who think they know the right answer. Right answers get you nowhere. Right answers close down the discussion. Whereas thoughtful, creative, open-ended sort of answers give you room to teach. Now, finally, what do we do for teachers? Those of us who are teachers in this room, who have been teachers or are thinking about teaching, what do we do to help them? There's a few things I would offer. First, teachers, when I started teaching, I remember the idea was that when I closed my classroom door, it was just me, in isolation. There was no group there was no network. We have to get rid of that idea. Teaching like being a good doctor or something requires us to have a sense of networking where we can draw on somebody else's experience. We can share with them things that go well or don't go well. And that kind of idea is so important because teaching is something you're still developing your whole lifespan. I've been in it for 45 years, almost, I guess, closer to 50 now. But in that time, I'm still learning. I'm still developing new ideas, and that's very, very important. And you need somebody you can turn to, someone you regard as a mentor in some area. It doesn't have to be all aspects of your teaching, but in some areas. And I want you to think about the fact that you're not done as a teacher when you have a diploma. You're not done as a teacher when you enter a classroom with your certificate. You are done as a teacher, maybe never. That it's a lifelong journey. You're constantly getting better. You're constantly exploring new avenues. The students change. The content changes. As things around you change, you're never done. One of the things I would urge you to do to break this cycle of looking at classes as separate units, looking at grades as separate pieces, looking at all those sorts of things as if they're in isolation, by doing some cross-grade planning, some work with teachers who teach different contents at the same grade level. Cross-grade, you work with a teacher who teaches at an upper grade level. Collaborate. Find out where you can find the threads that you can build on and the students can carry forward. And then, as I said, seek out real-world, complex problems to let the students ponder over and to tie the content domains together. If you don't have a professional group, you need one. We all do. Professors need them. Students need them. Teachers need them all the time. You need a professional group that can offer advice, workshops, materials, something to draw on. Now, quite different is every one of the teachers I know needs me time. They need time to be selfish for themselves. To have time to be leisure, I don't know what some people do, like go shopping would be mine, but that may not be your leisure activity. Reading books, going to a spa, soaking your feet, I don't care what it is. Me time is important. The other thing is it's so easy. Humans are creatures of habit. We are creatures of habit. Within 2 class periods, students will sit in the same seat. We did a study once. People go into restrooms in the same building, they'll go to the same stall every time. Why? Because we're creatures of habit. And that's true as teachers. We teach a lesson this way. The next time something similar comes up, we teach it the same way. Change up your style. It doesn't have to be a dramatic change, but don't teach everything exactly the same way. And also know the local community. Your students come from some place. And you may not know that place well. You should. Know the community around which you teach. Okay? I want to thank you again for inviting me. And at this point, I'm going to say questions, experiences, counterpoints, whatever you want to say. But again, thank you. And I only wish I was there instead of here. But thank you very much.